Okay, it's our final video in the ideology series. Anarchism, what is it? So we're going to go through the core principles, and I hope you appreciate what I've done with the A there. Isn't that cool? Okay, so anarchism is, you see it all the time, okay? We see it on walls, we see it as part of protest movements, we see it in Banksy's pictures, but yeah, it's kind of struggled to define itself. Not really surprising, because actually it just, the meaning of it comes from Greek, and anarchy literally means without ruler or authority, and most ideologies try and tell us what authority should look like. This one's saying we don't want authority, so it's almost no surprise. Okay, so the central thing at this level is probably anarchism's rejection of the state. Okay, and to give you an idea about this is quite a nice phrase from Emma Goldman, and she describes the state as a cold monster. Now, why should it be a cold monster? Well, I suppose because she says the estate is authoritarian, it stands above people, it has authority over people, and it lacks for reasons that we're about to go into, the human, warm, it lacks a kind of humanity. Okay, so it's this thing that lives above us, which kind of controls us, is a negative thing. Okay, but why is it so negative? Well, most anarchists say, in contrast to liberals who say there's a social contract, they argue that there was never any such thing. The social contract doesn't exist, and therefore the state is based on deceit and violence. So they say, yes, the state pretends to be there for your protection, but if you go against the state, you will see very quickly, as we see in the pictures here, the top picture being from the miners' strike of 1984, and the bottom being the picture of the Ferguson riots, that if you go against the state will come at you in a very violent in a very violent way, basically. Okay, so they go on to say that the state, what is the state? So the state is power. That means the instruments, law, police, ideology, probably even include the media in that, that the state has behind it. The state is authority, represents authority, so power with authority, i.e. That's the ability for an institution or person to make someone else do something that they otherwise would not have done. And if you combine power and authority, anarchists say you get this thing called government. And for them that could be a king, it could be a dictator, but it is power. Okay, so that is what government is, and that's why they reject government. Okay, because they don't want any authority over the individual. Okay, so let's carry on. Why is the state so bad? Well, and let's remember that anarchists reject hierarchy in any sense, okay? Because if you look at this hierarchy, what is a hierarchy? It's one person at the top telling others beneath them what to do, okay? And anarchists, personal liberty and liberty is so important to them that they would reject any kind of forms of hierarchy, be it religion or systems of thought, things like that. The state in particular, they say, is bad for three reasons. Now, two of these I find very similar. See what you think. So they say the state is commanding, so it has the ability to force individuals into actions. Okay, so for instance, you're forced to go to school. Therefore, individuals do not have autonomy under the state, and autonomy is the key thing for anarchists. They say the state is controlling. Now, I find this very similar to commanding, but they say that authority means people lose the ability to think for themselves as well, and that's quite key for anarchists as well. They have a very positive view of human nature, and they think if left to our own devices, we are rational creatures and we'll come to our own solutions. So that's keyed into the idea that they lose, that they, being the people, lose their true nature. If they're being controlled by the state. Now, beyond this, is it just the people beneath that are getting the bad deal? Well, anarchists say, actually, no, those on the top of the hierarchy will also lose touch with their true cooperative natures and become corrupted. So think someone like Tony Blair, who may think that he's doing things for very good reasons, but he actually gets caught up in his own power and his own authority and becomes a bit corrupted. Those underneath them are brutalized by the state, and therefore this leads to conflict. So the state, to recap, is commanding, controlling, and corrupting, and that's why it's bad for the individual. Um, okay, so what do we do about it? Well, anarchism, if you think about it, has a bit of a problem because you want to take over, you want to create drastic, radical change, but most people would do that by seizing the state. But anarchists don't want to do that. So how do you have the anarchism have the problems? How do you take over? How do you make change without taking power? And their answer to this is the following. Okay, so they want direct action. Or propaganda by the deed. So examples of this could be protests, it could be the non-payment of taxes, it could be the Zapatistas that we looked at from Mexico, it could be the Extinction Rebellion protests where they stopped people traveling in London or traveling down certain bridges in London and had a bit of a party in these public spaces. So it's not necessarily, they're not trying to seize government buildings, they're not trying to seize telecommunications, they are doing it by these other kind of means of insurrection. Okay, some anarchists, now lots of people when they hear the word anarchist they think of violence, but actually within anarchism acts of violence are actually very rare. So I think I spelled his name wrong there, but Alexander Berkman's assassination attempt of Henry Crick in 1892. Henry Crick was an industrialist and he was suppressing a strike, and this guy tried to assassinate him. Or the Baader-Meinhof gang in the 1960s, really 1970s. They were very active. They were German anarchists, leftist group, and they did assassinations and kidnappings and things like that. That said, most anarchists would reject violence, and particularly terrorism. Okay, so emerging revolution. So the last one is the final tactic. So it's constructing parallel institutions and allowing the state to wither and die. So Kropotkin and Goldman argued that terrorism is immoral and revolution must be achieved through cooperation and mutual aid. So what this means is, imagine that you you oppose the banking system because you think it's immoral and you think it exploits people, rather than smashing the banks and blowing up banks and stuff like that. In emerging revolution, you would create a people's bank, for example, and invite people to run it not for profit and allow the main institutions to wither and die. Okay, so liberty is obviously very important to anarchists, but what exactly do they believe about it? Well, it sort of might help you to think about it in terms of the other ideologies. And remember, this is always good synoptic links, so good links to the other ideologies will gain you marks. So in liberalism, liberty is the freedom to pursue your own happiness in your own way, isn't it? They believe in rationalism and they believe in the freedom to choose your own life. Okay, in socialism, liberty is the freedom from economic exploitations by capitalists and the state. Okay, so they believe that to be free, there must be some degree of equality, and you must have a certain quality of life. In anarchism, they really want to blend these two versions of liberty, so freedom of the individual and freedom from economic hardship. But they're slightly different in how they approach this. Okay, so what do they think? So individualists really believe that if authority is acting on an individual, they cannot make decisions based on reason and conscience, and therefore they are not free. Okay, so they cannot fully explore their individuality. So an individualist like Stirner would reject all kinds of control. So remember, if you remember, he rejected the church, religion, sexual codes, everything like that. He wanted complete freedom. The collectivists are a little bit different in their emphasis. So they see humans as rational, but argue freedom under capitalism is nothing but a cruel joke. So they emphasize altruism and cooperation. They think that that is the way that humans express their true nature and are therefore fully free. Liberty is only possible with equality, and enslavement is of one is of enslavement of all. So just because you think you're free, if someone else is still in chains, anarchists will say then you're not truly free themselves, and that's, I quite like that. It's quite a nice sentiment. Okay, so Bakunin argued freedom should be absolute, but only could have been achieved through collective work. So remember, he's a collectivist, but still thinks that people should have absolute freedom. And Proudhon argued that human individuality was a primary drive, and therefore worried about the group dominating. However, argued a group was more than the sum of its parts. So looking at this, you could even get a question about anarchism and freedom. Okay, and you do well to maybe like take a couple of notes on this slide, because they do think about it slightly differently, or they have at least a different emphasis, whereas they both think that freedom is fundamentally important. Okay, so let's go on to the next principle, that anarchy is order. That order will emerge from a stateless society, or a society where there's not a authority. So let's compare two quotes to do this. So we've got one from Proudhon that says, "Liberty is the mother, not the daughter of order." That's from Proudhon. And Locke, "Where there is no law, there is no freedom." So what's Proudhon saying? Well, Proudhon is saying that if you have liberty, order will come. And Locke is saying exactly the opposite. He says, where there is no law, there is no freedom. And presumably, if you have law, you need courts and you need authority, etc. So anarchists are, in a sense, completely unique here. So no other ideology believes that order will come from... I don't want to use the word chaos, because anarchists don't believe in chaos, and this is essentially really tied up with their positive view of human nature. So they believe that basically humans are programmed to cooperate, and then if you combine that positive potential with good institutions, and by which I mean cooperative, non-exploitative, non-authoritarian institutions, you will get order and harmony. And they say actually disorder and disharmony is created by the actions of the state, authority, hierarchy, those kind of things. Okay, last but one is economic freedom. So there's a bit of writing here, but here we go. So for most anarchists, the state has always been inseparable with exploitation and the hierarchy it creates. So most anarchists want freedom, or say they want freedom, in the economic sphere. So for example, the enclosures of the 18th century. So for those of you who don't know, this is when lots of land, previous to this act, was this act by the state. Let's not forget that. Lots of land was common land. So what is common land? It's land that is communally owned by everyone, and you can go out and graze your animals and do what you like with that land. Now, what the enclosures did was parceled it up and made it private. And if you go walking in the countryside now, you will find that most of the land, apart from fairly large national parks and stuff like that, is private land, and it's been parceled up. And so what this did is in the 18th century was basically chucked lots and lots of peasants who made a living off this common land by grazing sheep and stuff like that, basically made them landless. So what did they have to do? They had to go and find work in the factories, which were just starting during this century. So they became this kind of mass urban poor. They were very cheap for factory owners, and it was a very good thing for capitalists at the time. So what does that mean? Well, it basically means, it shows us that the state is willing to act in the interests of capitalism and powerful people. So what do anarchists think? Well, they're a bit divided on economic freedom. Some people think that you should have total freedom, and we'll see why, and some people don't. So Proudhon, let's start with Proudhon. So he talked a lot about this. He did not see all ownership as wrong, as some anarchists do. So some sort of collectivists, like anarcho-communists, think all private property is wrong. Proudhon did not. He did not see all ownership as wrong, and endorsed the right to possession, which is the right to small lands and tools and stuff like that, but criticised private property that gave the right to own without the need to occupy. I.e., he criticised private property, the ability to make a profit or rent without the need to work. So he would criticise interest charged by banks, rent charged by big landlords, stuff like that. All collectivists argue that private property basically leads to selfishness, and authority, and should be replaced with mutualism and collective ownership. Remember, anarchists think that human nature is moulded by the institutions that you have. So if you have institutions that encourage selfishness, you will get selfishness. On the other hand, anarcho-capitalists believe that everyone should be completely free in the economic sphere, and that economic transactions should be completely free of state control and interference for reasons of liberty and efficiency. So anarcho-capitalists believe in total economic freedom, but they don't mind if inequality is a result of that. So you might have a situation whereby individuals and companies are hugely rich and powerful, and there's nothing there to stop them, basically. But they would argue that that is complete economic freedom. Okay, so let's look at the last thing from our textbook. So this is utopian thinking. So this is the idea that anarchism is too idealistic, that it's kind of wishful thinking, if you like. So let's have a look at some of these arguments and some of the anarchist responses. So first argument is that anarchism is too idealized. Too much of its thinking is utopian, in that they want this just lovely, perfect world where everyone gets along. Anarchists reply, well, revolutionaries need to question everything. So even when it seems like common sense, so things like private property, if we don't question our basic assumptions, how will we ever get real change? An anarchist would argue. Next criticism is anarchism has never been realized in history, not properly, and therefore is unachievable. And anarchists come back and they say, well, a perfect socialist state has never been achieved either, nor a perfect liberal one. And there have been examples of anarchist states. So the Zapatistas have been going for about 30 years now. And in 1930s, Spain was basically a functioning anarchist society. And there are still anarchist companies which exist there. Lastly, lots of people think this, is that anarchism gets human nature wrong. Is that essentially, we are greedy and we are selfish and we need control. So this idea that you release us from control and that everything's going to be nice is ridiculous to lots of people. They think you'll get a sort of purge style situation. And anarchists come back and they says, well, they don't argue that humans are actually good all the time, but are realistic about human potential. So humans can act for good and organize themselves, and we see this time and time again. So when we read that article, we said, well, you know, if no one's looking at you, if there's no police there, do you elbow an old woman out of the way in a queue? No, you don't. You act decently. So anarchists argue we live in a world that encourages greed and self-interest. And what would happen if the opposite was true? If we lived in a world that encourages cooperation and altruism and rewarded those things? Okay, so in summary, I think anarchism, it may seem extreme, and I know some of you struggle with the ideas and thought it was a bit ridiculous, but anarchism argues not only for radical equality, but also, interestingly, that we take radical responsibility, that people take radical responsibility for themselves, and that's quite a right-wing value. So in a sense, it's quite an interesting ideology because it sort of combines the two. Okay, anarchism has really inspired, it may not have created a kind of perfect anarchist society, but anarchism and anarchist thought has inspired lots and lots of protests around the world, meaningful protest as well. And here we've got we are the 99%, so we are the people. And you can see this woman in the background. She says, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. And that's almost like a direct reply to this criticism of anarchism being utopian. Okay, a lot of people would like to see the authority of the state rolled back. They would like to see people taking you know, more interest in and having more power over their own lives, and maybe that might have positive results. Okay, we do have areas. So there's an interesting area in Syria called what's it called, Rojava, where it's an autonomous region in the north of Syria where Kurdish forces, including lots of women, are sort of taking control of the area and are doing it like a real direct democracy. So it has its critics, anarchism, but it does feed into a world and maybe provide some of the solutions that we're seeing in our very unstable world. Maybe handing true, genuine power back to the people is a potentially an answer. Okay, and that's it for what is anarchism.